Hi, good evening, everyone. There are a lot of people who are joining at the same time, so we'll begin. We'll take 2 more minutes to begin. By the time we begin, I would like you to participate in a poll that we are going to run. This is just a part of the entire process where we would like to know what do you think about the topic. So I'm going to run the first poll, and I would request you to participate. Here is the first question for you. So the poll question is there. What do you think business history should primarily be about? And I would request you to give your opinion. Thank you so much. Those who have joined just now, for them, a quick reminder, we are running a poll. The question is, what do you think business history should primarily be about? And the poll is on your screen. I would request you to participate.
So just to add, the second question is truncated. It should read, informing us about the contributions of past leaders, business leaders.
Thirty more seconds, and then I'll close this poll. So those who have joined just now, I would request you to participate in the poll. The question is, what do you think business history should primarily be about? Okay, so thank you so much for participating in this. Now I'm going to share the results. And I request all the speakers today to just have a look at the responses and see what people generally think about.
Thank you, Sudhir.
So I hope that gives you some perspective. Then I'll move on to the second poll before we begin. So those who are just joining now, just to give you the background, people are still joining at the same time, and there are a lot of people are in the queue. So we are just running a poll, and we want to know what do you think about the topic, and what do you think about business history. So the result of the first poll is out, and a lot of people, close to 53% people think that business history help us understand the role of business in society in general. Thank you so much for participating. I'll stop sharing this result, and now I would like to run the second poll. And I have, there is a little bit of background to this. I would request you to read the entire question carefully, because the first part of the question is the context, and second part of the question is something that is the real question. And I would request all the participants to participate in this. This is really a very interesting question. We'll run this question for the next 1 more minute. So those who are joining, I request you to participate in this. One caution, read this question very carefully. First part of the question is the context. Second part of the question is the real question that you have to respond to. This poll question is there for 30 more seconds. So thank you so much for participating in this. Uh, Now I would like to share the results. And I request Professor Aparaji to have a look.
Yeah, I think most people have got the second question right. It was Balchand Hirachand. And this is just an example of, a trivia question. It serves as, partly as an example, a context for what we're going to talk about. I mean, business history is, in a sense, not about this, right? It's not about knowing answers to such questions, but it's fun to know them. So we'll discuss about, if it's not about knowing the answers to such questions, what is it about, right? Also on the first question, of course, I don't think there's a single right answer. That's also context for things that we will, I'm sure, discuss.
Thank you so much.
During this.
It is 4:05, so now I would like to formally begin. Welcome everyone. I'm Sudhir Pandey. I'm your virtual host for the evening, and welcome to the conversation series webinar of Abdul Modi School of Management, Ahmedabad University. This is the seventh webinar in the series, and so far we have been doing webinars in the areas of management. For the first time, we have moved in the area of management, but particularly for us from humanities side. And just to tell you a little bit about the conversation series, why do we call conversation series? Because in this we invite top people from industry and one person from academics from our school, and they both engage on a topic which is very relevant for the management, education, or per se about management field. Sometimes it is a top industry leader and an academic, and sometimes it is all top academic people. Today we have one such panel, and I would like to welcome the panel. Before we begin, I would like to say a few words about the uh, some protocols that we have. Those who are joining in with their mobile, I would request you to rename yourself, because the problem is that you'll be asking questions and I'll tell you how to do that. But when you ask the question, your name does not come up. It is the mobile name that comes up, like iPhone or MI or something. So I would request you really to rename yourself, and you can ask your questions in the chat box. You can put it to everyone, and we'll pick it up from there. And at the end of the webinar, in the last half an hour, we'll take your questions and panelists will address those questions. So again, I repeat, rename yourself if you're joining from a mobile. That will be helpful. And if you have any questions, I would request you to put it in the chat box and reply to everyone so that we all get to know about your question. That helps us in two ways. One, we get the question and we get an opportunity to address it. Second one, if somebody has the similar kind of question in mind, they will avoid writing the same question, asking the same question. Now I have this unique pleasure of welcoming the guests. Let me begin with the first speaker of the evening. This is Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam. And Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam is one of the India's most distinguished business historians. She is currently a professor at the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, BITS Pilani, Goa. She has earlier taught for many years at Calcutta University and the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Kolkata. She was recently a scholar in residence at the prestigious Godrej Archives in Mumbai. She has written several books, including first one is Three Merchants of Bombay from Penguin in 2012, Indigenous Capital and Imperial Expansion, Bombay, Surat, and the West Coast. Oxford University, 1996, and Medieval Seafarers, Rowley Books, 1999. Professor Subramaniam is a prolific and wide-ranging scholar who also has many other interests, having written important books on the history of Carnatic music, the river Hooghly, and the role of music in Mahatma Gandhi's thinking. Uh, Welcome you, ma'am, and we are very delighted to have you in this panel. Second speaker in this series is a very dear colleague, Professor Aprajit Ramnath. He's an assistant professor at Ahmedabad University. His research is broadly in the area of history of science, technology, and business. He's the author of The Birth of an Indian Profession, OUP book, a social political history of the engineering profession between 1900 to 1947. And I had the unique opportunity to attend the book launch of this. This tells you the history of engineering in India. Very nice book to read. He has also written on the history of industrial enterprises like Tata Steel and Hindustan Aeronautics. In 2018, he received the prestigious Indian National Science Academy's Young Historian of Science Award. Over the past 7 years, Aprajit has taught courses in the broad area of business history to a wide range of students at Ahmedabad University and IIM Kozhikode.
तुम इसको फिर कान में लगाने वाला होगा ये
Third speaker is a dear colleague, Professor. Sorry, there was a bit of problem. Third speaker in the series is Tana Trivedi. She is a faculty at Amrut Modi School of Management. Tana's area of research is diaspora studies, and she has completed her PhD on Indo-Fijian poetry. Her area of interest is business history, and she is interested in exploring interdisciplinary pedagogy to teach history and management studies. She has over 15 years of teaching experience, ranging from literature to business communication and now to business history, which she has been offering to the undergraduate student at Amrut Modi School of Management for the past 5 years. I welcome all the speakers, and now I request you to take over and begin the conversation.
Thank you, Sudhir.
Thank you, Sudhir. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. There's been an overwhelming response to this offering, and we're really happy that you're taking time out on a Saturday afternoon to listen to us. And I'm very excited about this conversation because my colleagues Tana and Lakshmi have very interesting experiences, and of course are extremely accomplished in the field of business history. Without further ado, I'll jump into the structure of the session. We're going to have the following broad sections to the discussion, which I think you can see on your screen right now. We'll start with asking what business history is. We'll go on to ask why we should teach it, how we should teach it, and how does research in business history impact the above questions. And then, of course, we'll be very happy to take audience questions. I had a quick look at the registrations for today's program, and we're really honored because there are a lot of other very distinguished historians on this call, some of whom probably have more valid things to say than I. So where I can spot them and where we get questions from them, we'll try to bring them into the conversation. But this is not only an conversation between historians. We have several other students, educators, people from the world of business, practicing managers, and others from all over the country, and one or two from abroad who are on this call. So we are hoping that we'll make our discussion relevant to all of you. So I'd like to dive into the first question. If I could ask Lakshmi, in your opinion, what is business history? How do we explain this to someone who's hearing the term for the first time?
Okay, thanks, Aparajit. And let me, before I launch on to my own understanding of this subfield, let me thank the organizers for giving us this opportunity to be in conversation. It's rare to have an open and engaging conversation on a field that's close to your heart. So first of all, thank you. I think it's very difficult actually to come up with a pat and standard definition of business history without sounding facile. It was very interesting for me to see the results of the poll that we started this session with. And it was interesting to see that very few of the people who had polled had any patience for history. So it was either about understanding contemporary business or it was understanding the role of business in society. But somehow the idea of understanding the past did not seem to figure in that particular answer. Now, what I want to therefore say when I try to come up with a definition is that I could very well say it's about trade and business, it's about commercial activity, it's about circulation, but that would immediately prompt a so what question. And I myself would be in some difficulty to try and differentiate it from, say, economic history, within which business history is embedded. So I think my approach to understanding business history would be to reckon with the fact that there is a whole domain of productive activity involving buying and selling, but it's not just about buying and selling. It's not just about the rise and fall of business firms, of success and failure, but it involves understanding a much larger ecosystem of ideas, practices, cultural values, roots, in which you have massive volumes of productive activity managed, maintained, and that knowledge being formalized. So I personally want to say that I look at business history as a kind of portmanteau. It's like a very capacious subfield within economic history, but which is, or which has to be, attentive to the context in which certain forms of business activity are organized.
Thank you so much. That's really wonderful answer, because it puts so many of the issues on the table that we need to discuss. And one which of course you've written about at some length in scholarly journals is the question of the relationship between business history and economic history. So at the very start, if we could define these two terms for laymen. For laypersons, I don't mean that we will have a pat definition, as you just said, for each. But if you had to say broadly what's the difference, is one superset of the other, or what's the relationship between the two?
I would actually say that economic history, the way it developed in India specifically, and I'm not saying that it's overly context specific, but if you look at the way economic history in India developed, it was largely in response to two things. It was in response to the colonial impact that had major consequences for the Indian economy, and which produced either a very Eurocentric bias that sort of dismissed Indian economic activity as not so important, or there was a preoccupation with the agrarian sector, given the fact that most political regimes in India have been land-centric and have relied primarily on agrarian taxation. So when in fact you had a particular line of interest that began to think about Indian enterprise that could, if not match what the West had to offer, but which was certainly important in terms of scale, in terms of dynamics, in terms of productive structures and organizations, I think you had a genuine subfield developing that looked primarily at trade and manufacturing activity, including entrepreneurial activity more specifically. So I do not believe that one can decouple business history entirely from economic history, but I do believe that business history has enriched the field of understanding economic history by introducing some important new players in that scenario, but also introducing some very important methodological questions that we, I hope, will have occasion to talk about.
I think that's great. That's key. I think the methodological differences, or what makes business history a discipline. Is it a discipline? These are some of the questions we'll go into as we go along.
In fact, Aparajit, if I may just interject, one of the first discussions that we begin our business history classes with are to do with understanding what is economic history and what is business history. And, getting students to actually ask questions saying, okay, this is business history, this is economic history. Where do they intersect? How do they intersect? There are so many overlaps. At the same time, students also tend to look at economic history more in terms of policy making, more in terms of the nation, more in terms of a very large sort of a canvas. Whereas business history students tend to think about more in terms of business houses, in terms of the evolution and development of businesses against certain cultural, social context. So it is very important, like ma'am said, to understand business history as a much larger encompassing term, which actually helps in the understanding of economic history, because of course they constantly kind of merge, they constantly intersect at several levels.
And you pointed to people talking about business houses and all that. So, one of the things people, scholars sometimes say is that business history is looking at things at the level of the firm, whereas economic history may be looking at it, at the national level or whatever. So, Tana, you, along with another colleague of ours, Amol Agarwal, wrote an interesting article recently on Professor Vijendra Tripathi.
Yes.
And in that context, I was wondering if you could tell our audience a little bit about the institutional context of business history in India.
Sure. So, business history has been, I wouldn't say it has not been around or it hasn't been discussed, but I would say that as a course, as a subject, as a discipline by itself, has really not been examined very closely, or rather it has not been made a part of mainstream teaching. Now, the first instances of business history being taught formally is really can be traced back to the Harvard Business School, where you have historians like Chandler who start looking at examining business history and understanding the nature of business history given the historical context and engaging with it. And in 1970s, we have Professor Tripathi, which is where he's such a seminal figure in terms of Indian business history and examining it very closely. He was the one who started working on chronicling Indian business history. So he has uh, this colossal sort of a work, which is the encyclopedia of the history of Indian business, which for many years remained really the seminal text for anybody who wanted to engage with Indian business history. And he started teaching at IIM Ahmedabad in 1970s, and he taught it for a few years, and then again there was a huge lull in sort of engaging with business history as a subject, as a taught subject. Now we have Professor Chinmay Tumbe. I'm sure I don't know if he's joined us today here, who has been teaching business history for a while now at IIM Ahmedabad, and it's picked up. And of course, we now have a few more institutions around India who also teach business history, but it still largely remains, a subject that is not really taught formally in many of the institutions around the country.
Can I come in here,
Yes,
Aparajit? Yeah.
Please.
I thought I'd sort of link this particular issue that we are discussing with two things. I mean, can we then make a distinction between, or shall we say, can we make a connection between, say, the origins of the field of business history as it develops in India? What kind of locations do we find business history developing? And then think about the institutional context, because I think it's important. I think it might help us to define, to clarify, to amplify this field of business history that we are talking about. I think we have to recognize that the origins of the field of business history as we do it now in India derive from two specific locations. I can see it within the domain of economic history that was strong in history departments in Indian universities, also not so strong in economics departments, where economic history was a kind of poor cousin subordinated to economic theory. So you had one particular kind of interest in economic history by, scholars like Omio Bakchi, who were so important in writing about private investment, capital investment. On the other hand, with the rise of business schools, and certainly Vijay played such a seminal role in this, with the rise of business studies, you did have the development, and also I think with the development of plyometrics in the United States, you had a new kind of business history that was interested, of course, in the evolution of managerial and business practice, but you were also interested in models. You were interested in business models, and the two locations generated two specific concerns. And it's not as though there is no conversation between these two locations, but I think we need to recognize the two distinct trajectories that studies like this pushed. And I think if we remember this sort of locational difference in the way in which business history has been taught, whether in Indian universities or Indian management institutes, I think we can actually come closer to clarifying, amplifying, to illuminating the very conception of business history.
That's great, because I wanted to ask, continuing from that, there seems to be, looking back at the trajectory of business history, as a discipline, as a subject being taught, that it seems to have come about first in business schools or management institutions rather than university departments. So is there a particular reason for that? And does that have certain implications for the discipline?
I think that's a very, very important question to think about. I think it's a fact that it is with management institutes and business centers that a field specifically defined as business history is thought about. In Indian university economics and history departments, the tendency would be to look at agriculture, business, trade in the context of political economy more generally. But it does not mean that that kind of historical research did not provide the basic staple for business history to be taught later. So, when one teaches business history, one will think about Thomas Timberg's work on three Marwari firms. One will think about Omeo Bakshi. One will think about Blair Kling, who writes about partnerships, partners in the British Empire that talk about early business in Bengal, like Bakana to go. So I think, or N.K. Sinha, who writes on the history of agency houses, managing agencies. So I think I would not go so far as to say that business history as a subfield is to be exclusively associated with business centers or management institutes. But sure, they did give it a big fillip, making it, I think, or carving for themselves a distinct field. So I'll say that there is a conversation that goes on between the kind of history that you find being generated in university centers and a kind of business history that is being generated in institutes of management and business. My only concern is that the two have not been in as much conversation as we could have been. That's my concern.
Right, and I think that is exactly where we need to begin or start our discussions. And, especially now in times like these, where we really need to have conversations bringing, these two separate, not separate completely, but these two strands together for a more meaningful, holistic sort of an understanding of what is business history and the methods in business history. So I think that is very, very important.
That's great.
Absolutely. Tana, and just a very quick, sort of an afterthought that came. I think there's another very important difference in the locations and something which needs to be attended to. And I think Aparajit would probably have an interesting intervention here. I think with history departments, the tendency has been to somehow look at anything beyond the Bombay Plan, 1947, 1955, as somehow not history. And when you look at sort of business history from a management perspective, there's been a lot of emphasis on more contemporary concerns, contemporary ways of documenting business practice. Now, I think it's this particular lacuna also which I think has to be addressed. I think departments, histories have to factor in the contemporary much more critically. And on the other hand, business histories that are written of firms, preoccupations, market portfolio, risk decisions, have to also understand the historical context in which social connections are maintained and made. I don't think any enterprise, productive or otherwise, can really be understood without the social context. It's here that the history word does become very important.
That's so interesting, because sometimes I've heard discussions in And actually, I mean, as some of you know, I mean, I primarily identify, or my training has primarily been the history of science and tech. But a lot of the scholars I meet in conferences also turn up at conferences for business history. And so there's clearly business history is a, you know, it's a broad church in the sense that you have people who work on history of science, people who work on economic history, people who work on, you know, management theories, all of them meeting in a certain way. But one of the interesting things that people often say is that when we want to teach this subject in our department, or whether it's university or a business school, we want to brand it as something without the word history in it. Right? And they're pretty open about this. So there are, I mean, I don't need to go into particular instances, but there's some very famous courses which are business history courses, but which, you know, which don't have the word history in them. So
in fact, you know, this is something that even when Professor Tripathi, when I met him, you know, when I was designing the course and we were talking about it, the term history by itself is, is something that evokes certain ideas which really now need to change. They really need to, you know, history needs to be rethought also in certain ways. But I'm sure ma'am has some very important things to say about history, because I remember her taking a very strong stand about history and the significance of history. So yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the question is really boiling down to why teach business history with that history word, right? I mean, you're not saying why teach business is never a question. Obviously, we have to teach it. But why teach business history is a bit problematic. Now, I'm going to turn this question around a bit and ask why teach history at all, you know? And this is where I have a fairly strong position, because for me, as somebody who's practiced history of various kinds and who's had to confront serious methodological issues about history, I think it's not just about remembering the past in a mechanistic and mechanical way, but it's really about excavating the past's connections with the present. And that has a certain indication for the future. You cannot have a conversation about the present or have a projection about the future if you do not understand the past. So this is something, for me, it's vital to get at the basics of what constitutes historical experience, especially for business, that after all, as an organized economic activity, bears such an enormous societal responsibility. You know, it's not as though business is happening in a vacuum. Business is happening within a social context. It draws from the social context. It gives to the social context. It takes from it. So how can we actually think about understanding business unless we understand how organizations, practices, norms, deviations have evolved? So to me, the whole idea of not teaching business history, to me, is really a non sequitur. So that's as far as I'm concerned. But I think more immediately, this COVID experience of the pandemic, and the fact that it has in one fell swoop really undermined both social fabric and livelihoods, just makes it all the more important for us to understand how things have evolved over the years. So it's not the first time we have an epidemic in history. You've had epidemics in 1917. You know, India lost many more millions than we have as yet. And we've had enormous problems even then, and one coped with all the fault lines. So surely there is something to be learned about the ways in which historical experience does not recur in the same way, but certainly has some kind of pointers. So for me, the question of why teach history, why teach business history is fairly evident. Finally, I do want to say that, you know, when we think about teaching history or doing history, we're also very seriously thinking about how do you document our memory? How do we document our practices? How do we build repositories? What kind of protocols do you need to write business history? Now, you can't, you can't sort of just do business history because you happen to write about Walchand Hirachand. It doesn't work like that, because I think history, whether one likes it or not, over the last 70, 80 years has developed and refined serious protocols. And these protocols are important for us to understand. It's important for us to look at how facts are constructed, how facts are interpreted. Nothing is neutral. So just because we have a graph and you have numbers, it doesn't make it more scientific or more reliable than because somebody is writing a narrative. So I think there's a lot to be done about removing the cobwebs that we associate with history in a conventional sense, and take the conversation forward.
Great. I think that's fantastic. What you mentioned about Walchand, because I was just thinking of looking at all the correspondence. For instance, a case like Walchand, where a historian has the privilege of going into the archives and looking at the letters that he's writing to other people and so on. You get to see things that you don't see in the case of contemporary business. Right? We all know that big business involves lobbying. We know it involves political jockeying, but one of the things that historical studies allows us to do is, gives us the luxury of seeing things in a slightly more uncensored way. If we are lucky enough to have access to those archival materials, which often we're not. But when we do, we get to see, in a sense, people camping, their relationships with politicians, what is the context of, the colonial power and the and Indian politicians, World War II, American pressures, Lend-Lease agreement. All of these fascinating things come together, and we're able to see, and gives us the tools to look a little more critically at the claims that big business makes. And that's not to say that business is a bad thing, but it's to understand, in a more holistic manner, what it involves.
Sorry, just to interject, it's a very interesting perspective also, because when I take this to class, because for me, all my experiences, a large amount of my experience comes from teaching also. So when I think when I take this to the class, especially given the kind of audience that we have in Gujarat, right? Teaching business history is also important because it tells students about the significance of memories, about shared memories, about certain patterns, about certain ways of thinking which must be chronicled, or why have they not been chronicled. So say, for instance, there are certain business firms which have not chronicled, systematically not chronicled certain kinds of their practices, or, some bits of their information. It is very important for us to also get students to think along the lines of, therefore, about what is history, and what is the nature of history, right? History also in terms of memories, also in terms of shared memories, and what is it that must be preserved. So it typically, in a class that I have about 80% students who come from background of either entrepreneurship or family businesses. Now, immediately, what also interests them is, okay, look, I have my business, right? And in what way can I keep a record of it, or why is it necessary for me to understand where I come from? Where do I locate myself? Where do I place myself? And that also is a very significant part of business history, for in terms of contextualizing oneself. So
Tana,
at a personal level, at a very individual level, this becomes very important.
Just for context, Tana, could you tell our listeners the title and details of the course you're referring to, which you teach?
Right. So the course that I offer is a course on business history in India. So Indian history of Indian business, and we begin, so like we've also been we've been talking about it very often, and it's a conversation we have very regularly over the pedagogy, right? And as in, how do you teach a course like this? And for me, really, I have been teaching it for the past 5 years now, and every time I have tried to do it slightly differently from what I have done earlier. But the course is largely about examining the history of Indian businesses beginning from the 18th century, where we talk about mercantile capitalism, petty capitalism rather, going on to mercantile capitalism, and then going on to the newer ways in talking about business, moving from trading to business. Of course, and examining the backdrop, looking at the history. So in terms of the colonial history, which has played a very important role. Technically, about 26 to 30 sessions is what we have. And within these sessions, we systematically take students through the history of how businesses in India developed, in terms of also community based businesses, caste based businesses, because that is something very peculiar to India. We have a number of businesses which are particularly caste and community based. How did they evolve? Why did they evolve? Under what circumstances did they evolve? So we have a course which technically runs them through a chronology of the evolution of Indian businesses from 1700s to about mid 20th century. So the thing is, it is such a vast course that you can't possibly do anything more than just give a gist and quickly take them through it. But we stop at 1990s, when you're looking at globalization, opening up of markets. So we do that. I tend to spend more time now on looking at the 20th century, looking at colonialism, of course, but also post-independence, because I realize that that is also of immense interest to students now. So like I said, depending upon what the students are also inclined to, I kind of make some modifications. But maybe I'll talk a little more when we also talk about pedagogy, because for me, what is important is getting students to understand history in a very different way from what it is taught to them in schools. So looking at history as an everyday engagement, as something that is so alive, that is something that you engage with it every single day. You take it forward, you look at it as a projection of the future. For me, that has been very important. So that is what I usually try to do.
Great.
If that gives you some idea.
That's great. So it's really it's a very broad course. It's a survey course, which is kind
absolutely
of giving a background of business activity in India over 2 or 3 centuries. And this is typically taken by BBA students, undergrad students in business majors,
yes,
right?
Yes, it is. In fact, but I've also had engineers who have opted for this course, and they really took on to it very well. So it is open to all. It is a free elective. And even postgraduate students are sometimes interested in the course. So it's a course honestly open to all, but most times it is the management students who tend to opt for this course, which I think really needs to change now.
And I'm guessing that Lakshmi, you would have offered many courses which have been taken by history students as well as business students?
Yes, it depends on where I was located. I offered one particular specialized business history course for advanced graduate students in the National Institute of Indian Studies in ANIAS, in Advanced Studies in Bangalore, where I had structured a course that was titled From Dwarkanath to Go to Dhirubhai Ambani. That took them through business. And here we looked at business organizations, we looked at commodity supply chains, we looked at entrepreneurial decisions, we looked at big financial crisis and collapse when, the impact of globalization, if you will, in the 19th century really affects business right across. This whole chain gets disrupted. And of course, we also had a fair amount of fun with the relations between business and politics, which, mind you, is not new to post-colonial India. It's always been there, but which has had a particular flavor. So we ended with Dhirubhai Ambani as a sort of case embodying that particular nexus. Now, that course was very, very popular. And that course was very interesting because it challenged me to think a little bit more about the broad parameters of business history. Because I could ask questions like, what is the relationship between biography and history? Do we always tend to write business biographies and not business history? Is business history all about the history of success? If you fail, how do you reconcile with a past that is not comfortable? How do you put together an archive? When is an archive erased? When I was looking at the failure of the Bank of Bombay, Premchand Raichand, I desperately tried to get more papers. Now, that was exciting for me because it also enables you to behave like a detective sleuth. Okay, you don't get this, try somewhere else. Look at that series. Now, this critical engagement with sources with which you build a story, I think is absolutely vital to the discipline of history and business history. And this is certainly a transferable skill that I think business history can give whoever wants to do it. So that's one kind of course I did. When I taught economic history in the universities for a long time, I did take a fair amount of time in teaching about Indian business, where, of course, you tended to get mired in certain pet polemical controversies. So, did India have deindustrialization? Did India have a resilient bazaar? Was Indian business as good as what the West could offer? Or do we have to look at one silver standard that the West introduces? Or can we have our own jugaad, which is equally important, vibrant? So it made me ask a set of questions that went beyond the usual trap of debates that economic history gets mired in, which is why I still say that there is a huge space for business history, which can actually carve out a field for itself without necessarily going through the same old debates, which were fascinating. We all grew up on them, but which I think we can now take it as a set of important assumptions, but also learn to question them. And I'm saying that maybe doing the history of organized business, whether formal or informal, whether of networks or big firms, whether global or local, I think can actually make economic history itself more lively. So that would be my take on the kind of courses I did.
Thank you. That's really a rich answer, which ties in very well with with one of the questions that we've got from one of our viewers, who says, apart from big business houses, do business historians also consider and document micro business and the unorganized sector? So I think you just spoke to that question when you said, what is the
answer is a definite yes. And right now, it seems that there's a lot of interest in the unorganized sector. There's a lot of interest in, say, hawkers. Hawking is business. And, that requires a lot of logistics, management, supply chains. It's not easy. Just because you happen to hawk things on the streets doesn't make you less of a trader or a business person. So there is a lot of interest. The problem, however, with unorganized business is that you do not have the kind of archive that an organized business will have. See, if you don't have GST returns, you don't know what somebody is making. If you do not have papers, you do not know what he's actually taking away. So it has its share of problems. But on the other hand, there are other ways of entering the field. And this is where method is so important. You need ethnography. You need to do oral history as a method. You try and find unusual stories that may not be seen as deviant stories, but that are kind of exceptional, eccentric stories to actually prove a norm. So I think there are a number of issues that we can think about when we look at business history in terms of doing micro history as a history, as a case study, but also micro history as a method, which is what history normally engages with. When you scale down your scope of analysis and not scale up, what does it yield for us? What kind of material can we start thinking about? Can we look at unusual archives to try and figure out something which is slightly out of the box? I think these are questions which can make it also very enlivening. I actually think it's a very exciting field. So the question is, how do we actually teach it? How do we communicate it? I think this is important.
Thank you. That's a neat segue into our next segment, which is how should we teach business history? And I just wanted to start with Tana here. Tana, you've done some experimentation with data visualization techniques in your course. I was wondering if you could just talk us through that a little bit.
Right. So data visualization is something that I took to class because, again, I borrowed, not borrowed, but it's something that I had seen happening at Harvard Business School. I had gone through their site and I found it very exciting, the kind of work that they had done. And I said, why not take it to my class and see how my students respond to it? So I divided students into groups, groups, mostly about 2 or 3 students, and I got them to examine a business house, as in pick up a business house, maybe look at the stock exchange and look at the top companies in the Bombay Stock Exchange or the National Stock Exchange, and pick up a company and look and start examining the records of the company in terms of the financial performance. So you have websites like Money Control, and you have some other websites which also, some national websites also, which give enough data about the performance of the company. I got students to examine that and then draw a sort of a data visualization, for which I also took help of a colleague from the area of statistics, to help students to understand how to put data in a visual form. So it is not something that I could do it by myself, but I also collaborated with somebody else from the other department. I got her to come and talk to my students and explain to them how to you know engage in data visualization. That was very exciting for the students, because they could actually put into use some different skills that they had, some pre-existing skills, some new skills that they learned. And at the end of it, what they did was actually make a whole list of socio-economic factors that impacted the businesses during a certain time, and they put it in a visual form in forms of data. So it was an amalgamation of data, some bit of economic understanding, some bit of looking at social factors which have impacted the performance of the company. So things like that. For instance, if they looked at pharma company, they were looking at maybe the outbreak of certain epidemic which impacted the sales of the company, and what is the kind of impact. So they had to write a note on that. So I have been doing that. That is one of the exercises. The other thing that I do is I take students out of the class. I get them to actually go to the field. I get them to actually go to a bazaar and look at how the economy of a bazaar works, asking them to look at different divisions within the bazaar. And there is over a 600-year-old market which is still very functional, the Sunday market in Ahmedabad. I get them to look at that, and as ma'am was saying, talk to the vendors there, engage in some bit of a capturing of oral histories, and see how they have been, historically been associated with that sort of a business. So I attempt to do all that. I also sometimes take them to, I've taken them to Arvind Mills to see how, the denim is made, and looking at the history of the business, which is also very old. So this is what I've attempted to do in terms of the business history course. And like I said, I keep adding to it as we go by.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So I think you're talking about a combination of field visits, site visits, also collating data. So like Lakshmi said earlier, quantitative data can tell us some stories. Methods of the ethnographer can tell us different kinds of stories. And we can ask and answer different types of questions. Lakshmi, would you like to share with us some of the techniques?
Yeah, I think Tana is doing a great job. I mean, I really wish I could do the data visualization, but I think I'm far too old and a bit of a Luddite to be able to. I desperately want to use it, but I think I also want to think about the interface between technology and pedagogy a little more conceptually, which I haven't yet wrapped my head around. My own pedagogic techniques as far as teaching this kind of business history has been to take the students through the conceptual issues with a lot of help coming from my side, because I think, we can pre-circulate readings, we can tell them to read, but it takes a bit of time to be able to get into the density of the material to be able to really grapple with all the concepts. So I tend to do a 2-3 week real orientation by giving them all the concepts, trying to understand them, reading closely with them. But I think the technique that has worked most effectively for me, whether it's business history or any other kind of history I've taught, is to actually develop some kind of small curated projects. It could be an exhibition around a theme. So you think about, the institutions I've worked with have had papers digitized of insurance firms. So you take up a particular theme, say take Swadeshi and business, look at the matchbox labels, try and see what you can actually develop in terms of an exhibition or in terms of a small research paper that you want to do around an archive that you can read. So I find that kind of field visits to an archive very useful. The second pedagogic technique that I find really worked, of course, this is at a slightly advanced graduate level, the MPhil level. I find that students who are able to pick out their own local experience, as Tana said, are able to respond better then to the requirements of the course. So if I find a person who has been, quite familiar with, say, the floral market somewhere, who knows where the person is sourcing the flowers, whether he's taking a local train, whether he has the time, he's got the assistance to be able to sell a little more than a poorer person, to be able to find a hierarchy of market sellers. Now, that kind of ethnography, I find, actually helps them grapple with conceptual issues much more than just reading, which of course is important. I mean, without a conceptual apparatus, you can't go to the field. But, we are talking about young students coming and trying to understand. Here I find that these field visits and playing a little bit with archival material with a lot of help, and of course, playing with how to write a proposal. I think the combination of these three techniques would be my own pedagogic choice. I don't know how effective I've been, but I'll also have to say, and this might not be true for the institutions we are at the moment located in, but if you take an average university and you have students coming from very diverse backgrounds with all kinds of divides in terms of access, in terms of, access to particular modes of education and socialization, we are dealing with a very difficult and complex issue. And there, I think, to try and be as locally sensitive to the background of the student concerned, to what he or she is familiar with, might give us the key to opening up the more difficult conceptual issues that we grapple with.
Fantastic. I think that's really key. How to get them to latch on to something which is kind of familiar to them, and something which is part of their common sense understanding, even if there are certain misconceptions, and how to then broaden that into a broader, more theoretical, structural kind of understanding. One way which we do in a course called Ahmedabad is a Gateway to the World is, of course, like Tana, to take them into the field, but also look at primary sources like, a wonderful 18th century Persian text called the Mirat-e-Ahmadi, which gives in extraordinary detail, talks about the merchants, the merchants and the businesses in Ahmedabad, and the petty government officials, what they have to do, and so on. The other interesting thing, and I think we have Chinmay Tumbe on the call, who teaches at IIM Ahmedabad. Chinmay has used, I think, technology broadly defined a lot in teaching. Chinmay, if you're here, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, we can actually get some insights.
Yeah.
I've asked to unmute.
Yeah, thanks for having this conversation. So on technology, I mean, I have a Twitter handle and an Instagram handle on the course, which basically is used to disseminate information on aspects of business history. But more importantly, the student projects which are done gets linked to that. And it's nice because students get to see the presentations, the photograph of when they're presenting in class also posted and so on. And so there's a connect, but most importantly, there's a connect that remains after the class is over. And so it's nice because all these guys are still engaged on that. And so they're still seeing 3 batches down. So a person who graduated in 2017 is engaging with the person from 2020 because they're still following that particular handle. And it's not compulsory. So there's no penalty for not being on it. And none of the assessment of the course is linked to it. So it's completely voluntary option. But it comes from this idea that the bulk of the information consumed by, say, a generation of people between the age of 18 and 22 or 18 and 25 comes not anymore from newspapers or even websites, but through social media. And so, I mean, even I spend maybe half an hour, 1 hour every day on social media. So it's just that the way the sort of, especially the young generation is working, that I find that is the best way of dissemination. When I started, I didn't realize this thing that it would form a connect across the years. That's been a spillover benefit. And it's wonderful because people from past batches also still now comment and share stuff and so on. So it's great, not only for teaching, but I think even more powerful. In fact, I would say during the course, there's not much engagement. The engagement really comes after it. And people are in their jobs and doing different things. So that's the real power of using technology like that. The other technology, of course, in terms of classroom, I mean, that's pretty much standard, I think, what everyone is doing. There are also now fantastic history handles on Twitter and Instagram. I mean, absolutely fascinating stuff which I get to learn every day on that. And it's good. I mean, I see now, historians on it. Meda Kudaisia is on Instagram, so waiting for Lakshmi to come.
Yeah, so I think Lakshmi has just said she's a Luddite. I must add my name to that list. But I do know Chinmay has a very engaging.
I think Chinmay made an absolutely valid point. I mean, it's high time that one really started engaging with these things, and I agree with him actually. So.
Yeah. Chinmay has a really very engaging online presence. So all of you are on the call, students and others, please go look at it. He also has a website which has a very useful link to resources on business history, to secondary material, to archives or digitized material and other stuff. So please do go and take a look. Chinmay, I just wanted to ask you one more question, and then also Lakshmi and Tana. See, when we are teaching these kinds of courses as part of an MBA program, as you are, as teachers of business history, is it necessary for us to engage to have some idea of what else the students are learning in their other courses? So in other words, do we need to explicitly make a connection between what we are teaching and with the classical theories of management which they're learning in the other courses? Or to put it more bluntly, what right have I without an MBA to teach business history to an MBA student?
Mute.
You're on mute, Chinmay. Chinmay, you're on mute. Huh.
Yeah. So no, it's a good question, and of course it gets reflected in what students themselves ask. And there's also a question on the side which came on, is there something on like management history? And that's something I'm trying to do now more, partly because I've started publishing. I just take a few seconds on this. So we talked of economic and business history. Within business history, at least in Europe and North America, there's now a subdivision which has come from the push from management schools, which is management and organizational history. So today you have at least 3 journals. You have something called as a Journal of Historical Research and Marketing, which is management operation. You have the Management and Organizational History, which is a journal, and you have the Journal of Management History. So 3 dedicated journals for like a subdivision within business history. And that's come because of this demand from students, I would imagine, in business schools. So it's a very specific thing to management schools or business schools. Of course, I have, for example, advertising history. I think that would be something which is very catchy, which is obviously probably the best thing to teach in a classroom in business history in a management school would be the history of marketing. It's just so fascinating to see visual, because you have a lot of visual content from late 19th, early 20th century, and it forms an obvious connect in the classroom. So definitely, there are aspects of this, and then you can start connecting it to other departments. Now, one of my dreams, of course, that everyone at IMA incorporates some history. So it should not be just like a history course, but virtually everyone starts off their course with something of of the past. And so, for example, whatever I've written on marketing history, I've sent it to the marketing department. I don't know if they're using it or not, but at least they know that something exists on that line. I do know that now there are people across areas who know of resources. For example, the Times of India digital database, a fantastic resource. It's a newspaper resource which is at your fingertips. So my hope is that more people around start incorporating history creatively in their courses, which are not pure history courses as well. And yes, I do look at what students are learning in other courses as well, partly not to have repetition, some courses actually do start off, in fact, we have a course on, I think, philosophy, which has Aristotle. And it's a very it's got historical content, though it's not a history course per se. And so I try and ensure that there's no duplication of course in the course. So I'm very attentive to what's happening in other courses, and also hope that they also start incorporating history in some ways. And I've made slides. People have requested me, an economics course, macroeconomics course, show me a GDP chart from 1900. I've made a slide for them and supplied it. And so that sort of a thing is also useful. So when she mentioned data visualization, I think economics courses, even if they don't want to incorporate history in a very clear way, we have some decent statistics now from the late 19th century. One can have, fantastic charts on inflation, GDP, and so on. Somebody asked about the Spanish flu. It's a great way to, teach. There's a biggest cut in GDP ever was in 1918 during the pandemic. So I think these are, some of the things.
Thanks, Chinmay. That's fascinating. And Lakshmi, do you have something to say to that about, and how do we talk to a business student who says, why am I taking this course, and how does this connect with the rest of my curriculum?
Well, it's I think Chinmay has answered it quite comprehensively. Now, as I said, histories of management, histories of advertising, histories of production, histories of furniture, everything has emerged, right? And it's to do with the way in which disciplines specialize, the ways in which disciplines are located in certain contexts, which drive certain kinds of publications, and then you publish or perish. So for me, just having a journal and just having an institutional look, it's very important, but it will take time for something to be really well entrenched and established. Now, that said, I do believe that we have to be attentive to what is taught around the discipline that we teach, the contiguous disciplines. Now, I can speak from, at this point of time at BITS, where I teach an elective course on history, which is History of Modern India, which is about the Great Transformation. And I know of very eminent colleagues who teach ethics, who teach development, and I think they're very important. Because I think unless you understand the ways in which certain ethical positions have evolved or get distorted or get aborted, you really don't understand the larger ecosystem, the larger social context in which anything happens. So I think whether it's science, technology, or business, I think it's up to the instructor to be able to be attentive to the contiguous disciplines and to be able to communicate to the student the validity and salience of whatever history it could be history of philosophy, it could be history of ethics, it could be history of advertising, which by the way is very important and cannot be detached from history of capitalism. You advertise in a particular way when you want to scale up production. So it's very much the history of capitalism, which will take me to development studies. So I don't think we can remain in silos anymore. I think we need to preserve our turf. We are all very conscious of our training, of our protocol, of our disciplinary loyalty. But nonetheless, we need to be able to speak to each other. Otherwise, we'll continue to do the same old boring history, which nobody wants to do and which they think is for, dummies. Or we do things where everybody who has not been trained wants to write history. So, I have a problem with this paradox.
Well put. I think this ties in with what Professor Sashi Sivaramakrishna is just saying on the comments, that, I quote, one needs to go beyond narratives and ground analysis in business and economic theory, to which we could add also in the historical method or the methods of doing history. I think we also have Srinath Raghavan on the call, who's written some fantastic books on the history of India's participation in the major wars of the 20th century.
Yeah, superb work.
Yeah, and Srinath, I'm sorry to cold call like a class, but would you be okay with telling us, making a few comments to us? I have a question for you if you're okay.
I also find one Madhumita Mazumdar with a raised hand. So
maybe... yes. Okay, so while we wait to hear from Srinath, let's move into our Q&A session. The last section on research business history, I think we've talked about, and we'll cover it in questions. So Madhumita Mazumdar is a historian of science who teaches at in Gandhinagar. Hi, Madhumita. Would you like to ask your question?
Madhumita, you're on mute. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Lakshmidi, for that wonderful presentation. Of course, I enjoyed the entire length of the conversation you've had up to now. Just two quick things. I think one thing that Lakshmidi said and others agreed, that for anyone who's actually teaching business history, it is important and absolutely critical to actually engage with the history of the discipline. And I say this because many of us who were introduced to histories of enterprise were sort of in a way learning it from the lens of what Lakshmidi defined as economic history. I remember particularly the book that we read in my undergraduate class, Indian Industrialization Between the Wars. I think it was by Professor Rajat Kantare. And we had a kind of sense of the industrial houses, their collusions, their collisions with structures of power, internal rivalries, and what they did and all of that. And also because of the fact that in undergraduate classes, we also did economic history, which actually looked into what one can broadly call the forces of production, land, labor, capital, enterprise. Now, we'd had lots of history as far as the land question was concerned. We did a lot of labor history in Bengal. As far as enterprise was concerned, it was limited, but it was emerging. Now, therefore, to actually teach business history, one had to kind of understand the broad rubric on the one hand of forces of production. And of course, consumption becomes an important aspect as well of the story, which we just had heard from Professor Tumbe. Having said that, there's also the other question, therefore, that when we are looking at institutional contexts, we also therefore look at the questions, as Lakshmidi said, and those questions, I think, may not be all that irrelevant up to now, because, having made the transition from Calcutta to Ahmedabad, for example, if I were to teach a history of industrialization today and look at the context where I'm staying at right at the moment, I realized that we had absolutely no understanding of the regional and local trajectories of industrialization and modernization in various parts of India. For example, in Gujarat, where I didn't do any particular history, but a student of mine, a design student of mine, who wanted to do some, study of Morbi as emerging as a cluster for ceramics production. I mean, that took her into the story of the princely context, industrialization in princely context, moving there from the emergence of cluster-based, caste-based businesses and so on. Absolutely. And it also brought a sense of the importance of geography. It's not just, industrialization in a very broad kind of sense, but looking at geographical specificities. So, if somebody teaching industrialization in India from Gujarat would have a different perspective from someone who was teaching in Bengal. So these need to be brought into more conversations. I think that's one. And of course, I think that, when we look at methods and what is business history, I'm as sort of in a way, not confused really, but I say that I wouldn't have an answer just because just like I don't have a quick answer for what STS includes or does not include. And Aprajit would know what exactly I'm trying to say, that it is a huge, an evolving field where you can have, perspectives from anthropology, from sociology, from history, and so on. It's interdisciplinary. Business history, by definition, has to have these interdisciplinary methodologies. And an institutional history or a disciplinary history will tell us how we entered into conversations with other disciplines and help the discipline to grow. Last point, that you're saying that students are not particularly interested in history, but to my mind, as I teach young students today, they are really interested in questions of the past, maybe not the sort of long past, but the immediate past, because there are very politicized questions about the past. particularly post 47, the paths we took and we did not take, who did wrong and who did right, what were the, they are hungry for those answers. And most of the answers that they're getting are from social media, which may or may not be the best thing for them. So yes, there is a sense of, hunger for history, but it has to be sort of in a way presented, possibly in a way that makes sense to them from their own perspective. So I think but thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful conversation up to now. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhumita. And you mentioned recent past. Srinath is just here with us.
Yeah.
And Srinath, you've done, what for many of us is the word escapes me now, but the thing that we would like to do but can't do easily, which is to write a history which is very recent, and the 1970s, for instance. And Madhumita was talking about students being interested in that kind of history as well. And clearly, many of us think that, or believe that archival access is a huge issue. Could you tell us something about those challenges, and also any other comments that you might have?
Yeah, so maybe I can come to the archives in one thing, but first of all, I mean, thanks for bringing me to the conversation. I really enjoyed the discussion, and really interesting to hear what the three of you were talking about. I just wanted to come in from a slightly different vantage point of someone who is not necessarily a self-identified business historian, which I'm not. I'm just an interloper in this conversation, as in this call. So, and I just wanted to say that I thought a lot of the discussion was really about trying to define the boundaries, both in terms of what is the area and thematic and methodological kind of focus of business history, to delineate its institutional spaces, whether it is in business schools and so on, and to think about what are the kinds of other institutional structures which you need to sustain a subfield like that, which is journals and other things. Whereas to my mind, I mean, I think the potential of any subfield, but especially one like business history, is really about demonstrating how business history really throws light on the more central historical questions of any period, right? I mean, as a historian, I'm not interested so much in business qua business as in a certain kind of a historical problem, and how business history can do it. And if I look at some recent stuff that has really struck me, they've all been at this kind of a cusp of things which help us answer very important questions. I mean, to give you two examples, one from the United States. There's a book by the environmental historian Richard White called Railroaded, which is really about the Trans-Pacific Railroad in the United States and its construction. It's a fantastic blending of business history and environmental history, right? And really, I mean, without making any attempts to talk really about disciplinary boundaries and so on, he just uses the material in such fantastic ways, right? I mean, an older book, and I'd say a classic, is William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, which is about the making of Chicago, which again, I think is one of the finest business histories that I've read, even though it is not identified necessarily as a business history. So I'd say that, there is something perhaps to be said that even as we are trying to develop a new area of work and give it fillip, and we do want to, chart out a certain terrain, which is exclusive in some ways, but also to speak to the connections that we want. And in that sense, I have always found that, business history is interesting to me because it speaks to the kinds of problems that I'm interested in. For instance, when I was working on the Second World War, it was very clear that the business history of that period was very important, not just to understand the economic history of the war, but to understand the history of the war per se, right? There were many problems which could not be, you could not come to grips with if you were not willing to engage with these materials and this terrain. And thanks to, Dvijen Tripathi and the origins of the discipline, I think business history in India has always been quite, closely integrated with social history, as Professor Subramaniam was also saying. So I think it's time now to branch out a little bit more. People like you are doing work in STS. So I think we need to embed business history more centrally in the concerns of the kind of questions that we are interested in asking. So I think that's the first question. The second is about archives, and I think their business history actually raises an interesting question, which in some ways is not just about the availability of archives, right? See, a lot of us, especially through our training and the way we train students, is you train on archives that are easily available, right? So you teach them how to tackle questions. They know a reasonably well mapped out archival space. They go there, find new things which speak to their questions, and then try and answer them. Whereas with business history, obviously, what is available and what is accessible is very much a question which is not that easy to answer, whether in the contemporary period or even going a little further back. For instance, I mean, you take the Tatas, they have a fantastic archive, but if you want to read JRD Tata's correspondence with whoever it is, you're not going to get access to it, right? Unless you know somebody really high up in the Tata group to kind of ease your access, and then you have to kind of sign off on various kinds of things. So it's a fantastic archive. It's very well organized, but you and I and most ordinary mortals can't get anywhere close to accessing that archive, right? So there is always a condition, which I think is, again, a general problem for historians, which is that how does our archive get constituted? Which I think we must have even greater sensitivity to that question in the context of business history. For instance, again, a country which is, to take another example of Germany, right? Some of the best German histories, business histories, were actually written in the late 1980s, partly because, most of these companies wanted to come clear on their Nazi past. So they actually, gave his proper historians full-fledged access and said, go and write these histories, right? We'll have to deal with this past, because we have to sort of, now German companies were going multinational in the 1980s. They wanted to sort of clear themselves of all the things, especially to access the American market. So, right. So it is that kind of a consideration which actually allows some fantastic histories to be written. So I think we have to be mindful of that as well. And yes, the recent past is a problem, but I don't think it's any more of a problem than even some of the older things are, right? And of course, I mean, how old does old get? I mean, someone like Professor Subramaniam here has worked on the early modern period, and clearly there are different scales of challenges there in terms of languages and so on. But I think what we need is to sensitize people to saying that it is important to link business history to the more central questions, and history is a discipline which evolves by questions, right? I understand that in a business school context it might be taught somewhat differently, and it will have its an important audience there. But I think there are other audiences to which you should reach out.
Thank you, Srinath. I think that speaks to, Lakshmi, what you also wrote in your article in EPW last year, which was which I found really fascinating. So if you wanted to add something on that.
No, I think both the questions and rather comments have been really pertinent and central to what we've been saying. But I'd just like to pick up on what Srinath said, particularly on the archive question. I think this is actually, he's really nailed it. This is very central. Of course, it's true that historians are particularly obsessed with the archive. That's our laboratory. And there is the problem of access. So you may not get access. But on the other hand, unless we sensitize through history and its particular relationship with the archive, how are you going to enable society to reconcile with pasts, whether it's business houses or anything else that may not be so comfortable? See, Germany has been able to reconcile with the Nazi horror. Have we been able to reconcile with many things? So I think it takes a lot of maturity, a lot of time and experience to be able to arrive at that sort of reconciliation, and which is why I think doing history with proper protocols, thinking about archives critically, not as some kind of repository of memorabilia, but something which is stored with a particular logic and rationale, and to try and be as open as possible, I think is crucial. And I do think that some business houses are playing an important role. I mean, the fact is, we do have an archive like Godrej Archives. We do have an archive like the JRD Tata Archives, whatever the limitations of access. Now, if we did not have it, we wouldn't be able to write even that. We wouldn't be able to write about steel shortages with the kind of criticality in the 50s unless we had what Godrej was writing and saying how difficult it was for him to make his tubular steel. So I think I absolutely take the point that Srinath said, and I would endorse it.
Thank you so much. I can see a lot of questions in the chat box and comments as well, and this has been really engaging. One of the questions that I would like to raise and request Professor Lakshmi to answer is that by Sanjay Mukherjee, and he's saying that can business history give some direction in starting the economy now when we are presently in COVID situation? I mean, do you have?
Are we grouping questions, or should I just answer?
No,
that's a tough.
Yeah.
Okay,
you can
tough one. I have absolutely no magic solutions for dealing with what we are going through. It's an unprecedented crisis. All that I do know is that having some kind of historical perspective on the way in which contagion in any society at any time generates certain kinds of responses, I think is useful for us to be acquainted with that. It's not as though I'm going to replicate the same solutions that we had in 1918, but at least I could be aware of all the social fault lines and avoid certain mistakes and try and think about a more empathetic understanding of ramping up economic activity. So I'm not saying that business history is going to have answers for what to do, but I think it will certainly make us more empathetic to understanding the crisis of the present, without which I don't think we can even begin to think about a repair.
Thank you so much. And the next question is by Professor Ravi Miglani, and for me also it is one of the most relevant questions. The question is, you earlier mentioned that MBA programs seem to shy away from using the word history when offering courses in business history. Do you have ideas on courses names that might be more attractive than business history to MBA students?
Well, Ravi, for me, dropping history from business history is an anathema. So I'm not going to be able to find alternatives for business history to make things more palatable. The question is, ultimately, what you teach, the course that you teach MBA students will be made up of a lot of things. If you feel that the things that make up the course have a strong historical component, I don't see you can get away from using the idea of business history. If it's about models, if it's about entrepreneurial decisions, if it's about strategy, if it's about firms, then you can call it business studies. But for me, business history is a very definite location, genealogy, and a future.
Thank you so much. There was another question by Prasanna Kumar, and he's saying that I'm a working professional and I want to know the history of business management. Does it fall under with business history, or it is some sort of organizational history? So what is your take on this? I mean, any one of you
I think Aparajit and Anna could answer that better than I could. I mean, I have some ideas, but maybe I'll let my other panelists come in.
Sure. I mean, my understanding is that like Chinmay alluded to earlier, there are a lot of journals, a lot of scholarly societies coming in neighboring fields. So we have business history, we have history of management thought, management and organizations. All of these obviously are related, but the focus will differ a little bit. So if you're talking about the history of management thought, then typically it's a cousin of intellectual history, in the sense you're looking at particular theories of management. So typically a course like that would talk about the origins of scientific management, the assembly line, various theories of how to handle human resources and so on, and try to locate that in their historical context. Where did they emerge from and so on. Whereas when we talk about business history, we're using a more broad term that can have more broad questions. It can be about what strategies did firms use, what is the social background of entrepreneurs. So many other questions can be asked. Right. So I think history of management or history of management thought is, in a sense, a more specific subfield of what we've been discussing.
Another follow-up question from Prasanna is, and that is very interesting, are business historians in the country engaging with the corporates? And is there a demand from corporates to learn from the past?
I think, Lakshmi, your experience in Godrej would be great here.
Well, two things. I'm going to answer it in two ways. There is, of course, the business of literary festivals. So we had this business literary festival in Bangalore where we had lots of interesting corporate people who came and wanted to know about books that we had written on business. Some of them themselves had written histories of their success or failure. There was a real sense that they all wanted to write history, which is why I'm saying this paradox of everybody wanting to write history, but not wanting to call it that. But anyway, be that as it may. So I think there is a genuine interest among corporates to get a sense of their immediate historic past, whether it's of their firm or of their families, or of the larger field of, say, startup capital, startup ventures. So there is an interest. At the other level, I think some corporates have been very, very attentive to looking after their own documentation and do want histories written. So Godrej Archives, for instance, has instituted a new program in which I was actually, a scholar in residence, and I've been asked to write a history of 3 products And I'm writing on the Godrej store wheel, the Godrej office chair, and the Godrej refrigerator. And I am, in a sense, talking about commodity, the making of modern Indian office and home spaces. And I'm also talking about a modern manufacturing house that becomes a household name. This is the history of business, but it's also a history of objects, of social values that we attach to the store wheel. It's an anthropological exercise, so it's everything. So there is, as Madhumita had said, an inherent element of interdisciplinarity in the kind of business history one would want to do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Aparajit, would you like to take one of the questions from the chat?
Yeah, I think Tana, would you like to take the question from Ruchika, who says, can we learn something from the rise and status of trade guilds from ancient India to new generation business people who can be from any community? We generally hear that certain kinds of community are service class, business class, etc. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. So, we do discuss community and caste-based businesses because that is something that's, that's extremely Indian in a sense. Even now, even in this day and age, we still have people following their community and caste-based businesses. So in that sense, it gives an insight into where that business, how it developed and what is the contribution of a community to the development. For instance, we are looking at the contribution of Marwadis, or we are looking at the contribution of the Parsis, and it is important to see how the community supports or aids in the development of those particular kinds of businesses. So of course, it would help immensely to look at the evolution of that community-based business. Definitely help even in today's times. I think it's very important. It's very important in terms of locating in putting yourself in that context.
Thank you. Sudhir, how are we doing for time?
Yeah, 5 more minutes we have. So
okay.
One of the questions that you can take.
Let's see.
Maybe I can come on to that question on the guilds. I think it's a very interesting question. I think there's been a lot of interesting work on trade guilds, whether it's from ancient India or from medieval Indian Ocean, think of the Geniza papers. So there's been a lot of interesting work, but I think it's also interesting, perhaps instructive to think that we also need to go away from purely community orientation of business. I think one of the things that a new book, the book by Damodaran, for instance, India's New Capitalists, I think tells us is how modernity and the experience of modernization actually throws open the field of business to a much wider miscellany of castes and social groups. So I think it might be interesting for us to think in terms of temporal frames, to think in terms of the way trade practices, business norms evolve, emerge, and also change. I think one of the fun things about doing history is to actually continuously quibble over crisis and continuity and transformation, seamless change or not. And I think this gives you a lot of scope to think, to think through, to debate. And that's which I really want to emphasize. I think for me, history of any kind is really about remaining attentive to difference and to debate. Debating is central to the discipline. And I think for me, that is, critical inquiry. And that for me is a very important pedagogy. Whatever kind of history we do, we are not here. It's not as though business history is only about talking about the glories of India's business past. It can also be about deep failures. It can be about deep social drawbacks. It can be all of that, but we need to know it. So that's the note on which I would, sort of end this intervention.
Okay. One last question, and which I think it is really relevant, and after that we can end, and other questions we can address through mail or something. It is from Rakesh Yadav, and Rakesh is saying that how do business historians see this large dissociation of business from people enabled through marketing? This has been further exacerbated by the rise of technology business, which has given rise to wealth in economy, but rising inequality than ever witnessed. What lessons does business history have in addressing it? Are we going to witness more Occupy Wall Streets or Sanders or all? So he's saying that how technology is affecting and how do you address this?
So Aparajit, would you like to come on that?
Sure. Thanks, Rakesh. I think clearly part of the answer to that is, what are the different types of things that business histories or business historians can do? What are the different kinds of questions we can ask? And there's a very broad spectrum, as we've discussed in this throughout this conversation. So it ranges from some people who are quite legitimately more interested in, what can we learn in terms of from the past in terms of best practices for the individual firm, to people who are more interested, like to an extent myself and Srinath, in what does this tell us about history in general and how society in general works, right? So if we ask our questions more on the lines of what a social historian would do, so for example, how do businesses relate? We've discussed how do they relate to traditional communities, how do they relate to to democracies. So for example, do businesses and industries thrive more in more open democratic societies or in more authoritarian societies? Do they does big business is the the larger questions, is the business of business only business, or is it something
good,
beyond that as well? So I think these are all the kinds of questions we can ask. It depends upon the particular researcher's interest. It depends also on the kinds of materials that we can get access to answer those questions. But yes, I think this is a great opportunity, what you have mentioned, for historians to get into these debates, because they are very, very contemporary, of great contemporary relevance.
Thank you so much. We are close. So any closing remarks that any one of you would like to say, Professor Lakshmi?
I just want to say that this has been a great conversation. I'm really pleased to have been part of this, because I think it's really opened up not just the field, which is what we were initially interested in, thinking about the challenges and the scope of business history, but really has given us all an occasion to reflect on the ways in which we can, in our own ways, reflect on our immediate present situation, but also think a little bit about the past, in which we are always in conversation. Business happens to be one important lens to look into these larger issues, whether it is the pandemic or whether it is, Occupy Wall Street or social inequality or digital divide. I think business history offers a very important lens to look at this larger sociology of economic activity and practice. So I can only say that this has been very, very illuminating for me, and I've been delighted to be part of it.
Thank you so much. I'm very thankful to all the three speakers, Professor Lakshmi, Aparajit, and Tana. This has been really remarkable discussion, and I'm thankful to the IT team and people in the team who have been behind it for almost 15 days, and we have been working on this. At end, I'm also very, very thankful to all the audiences who joined and they asked very relevant questions. That is one thing that we really liked about this conversation series. The kind of questions that we get that reflect the kind of quality of the audience and the quality of the discussion. So thank you so much.
Sudhir, sorry, I'd also like to thank Chinmay and Professor Raghavan for talking to us. I think thank you so much for being here. I think we took you by surprise, but it was really very gracious of you to kind of engage in a conversation.
Madhumita as well, everyone who chipped in. Thank you.
Everyone, yeah.
No,
Thanks
wonderful, and thank you, Sudhir. Thank you for being there and choreographing this whole thing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So I formally end this conversation now. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.